Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next webinar in our series. In this webinar, we'll be continuing our conversation about what it means to operate and pursue our missions in a changing world. I'm Michael Cass. I'm a consultant with Nonprofit Finance Fund, and I will be guiding us through this conversation. But before we start, and you'll notice this with all of the webinars in this series, we're going to slow down for a moment to acknowledge the history of the land that we're on and the peoples who are its ancestral stewards. So I'm recording this from the land of the Tewa people. Today it's known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And before we go any further, I'd like to encourage you to just take a moment to acknowledge the peoples on whose land you may be residing. And the reason that this is important for our conversation is that we're talking about the systems within which our organizations operate, and those systems exist within a greater context of the history, not just of our organization, not just of our communities, but of the land that we're on and of the country that we're in. And if we really want to dedicate ourselves to change, to being part of building a more vibrant and equitable, sustainable world, then we have to really think about everything we do within that larger context. So before we go any further, what I'd like to invite us to do is just take a nice slow breath to acknowledge the history of the land and its peoples. Thank you. So once again, these webinars are presented by Nonprofit Finance Fund. Something really interesting about this organization is that we've been around for about 40 years, and you can see on the slide all of the various things that we do now, but we were not always this organization. Nonprofit Finance Fund actually started with a very narrow mission, a very narrow scope of work, and over the decades expanded to meet the needs of the community. And as we did that, we had to revise our business model. We had to really look at our capital structure. So all of these things that we're talking about today don't just come from sector-wide best practices, but also from the lived experience of Nonprofit Finance Fund. This is the team that'll be presenting the first group of webinars. That's me, Michael Cass, Christine Alvarez, who presented part one, and then Monica Kubasek and Robert Kagan will be joining us as we move through these webinars. So our learning goals for these next few minutes together first is to create a little bit of context, to explore the impact that the pandemic has had on the not-for-profit sector. Second, we really want to deepen our understanding of capital structure of our business model, continue that conversation that we started in part one, and look at how it impacts our organization's futures and impacts the way that we pursue our mission. And finally, we'll look at some high-level metrics with the goal of learning how to assess our organization's financial health and align our decisions with real-time data. Before we get into all that, I want to acknowledge that these conversations we have about nonprofit finance, about making data-driven decisions, do not occur in a vacuum. The conversations about financial management are actually very human conversations that have implications for our culture as an organization, for the communities we serve, and for our missions. And so we really want to acknowledge that the past year, in fact, almost the past 2 years, has taken an incredible toll. There is no precedent for the times we're in, both in terms of the pandemic, in terms of climate change, in terms of the social and economic upheaval that perhaps ourselves or the people around us, the communities around us may be experiencing. So there's no right way to feel or react, whether it's to the world around us or to the financial conversations that we're having in this series. There is, however, an invitation to slow down. When everything starts to move quickly, when things start to feel chaotic, the tendency is to want to speed up, to try to meet urgency with urgency. But that can lead to burnout. That can lead to decisions that are made in haste and decisions that are made not based on the best possible information. So the invitation in these conversations, and maybe in general, is always to slow down and really see if we could take in not just the informations, but the implications of it. When the pandemic started, of course, not-for-profit organizations were deeply impacted. So last year in 2020, Nonprofit Finance Fund put out a survey asking organizations from all over the country, how has the pandemic affected you? And almost 500 organizations responded. And here's what we found. The most common impacts were challenges with staff and volunteer availability. People became less available. Some were unable to provide essential services. We had some organizations report that they had to cancel revenue generating programming because they simply couldn't be in physical space with others. There were generalized destabilizing conditions, significant changes in demand, both decreases in demand, but also some organizations reported that their services were much more in demand than they had been before the pandemic. And finally, many organizations reported reduced government, private, and earned funding, right? So they saw their income take a little bit of a hit. 1/3 of the nonprofit organizations had less than 1 month of cash in the bank before the crisis hit. So before anything became destabilized, they were already a little bit pressed for cash. And 2/3 of the organizations indicated that just a few weeks into the pandemic, they were facing crisis. Now, some of this may have changed over the past 18 months with the infusion of COVID relief funds, and a lot of organizations, perhaps yours as well, have been able to pivot and find kind of a new stability during these times. This is kind of a snapshot of what we saw fairly early on in the pandemic. So when it comes to talking about how we respond to the world that we're in, and here today we're going to be talking about business models and capital structures, but that doesn't exist in a vacuum. Again, as you learned in part 1, we really consider our strengths or our capital not just to be financial, right? Our strengths and our mission success is really tied to our strengths in 4 areas, right? Of course, there's financial, but there's also, what do we know? What's the data that we have? What is the sector knowledge, the mission knowledge that we have that nobody else has? And by the same token, what are the relationships and reputation? What are the people and skills that we can bring to bear in the pursuit of our mission, right? On the one hand, we could have all the data and know-how in the world, the best relationships, the best people and skills. And if we don't have the capital to fund our mission, then none of those strengths will really do us that much good. On the other hand, if we have all of the capital in the world, but we don't have the relationships and reputation, we don't have the people and skills, we don't have the data and know-how, well, then that also compromises our ability to achieve on our mission. So when we talk about the business model, right, the day-over-day operations, we looked at this in part 1. It's worthwhile to review it. Our business model answers the question, can we cover our costs? Are we bringing in enough money to support our mission and contribute to consistent surpluses? And consistent surpluses don't have to be a lot, right? It just means ending every year being able to contribute a little bit to your organization's reserves. Those surpluses build our balance sheet. It builds what we own versus what we owe, right? So that over time, we're able to reinvest into our business model by supporting our infrastructure, either our physical infrastructure, by bringing on new staff, by expanding our programs, all in alignment with our mission and our vision for change in the world, right? So over time, we're constantly, in an ideal world, building our surpluses, building our balance sheet, and being able to reinvest into our business. Now, there may be times where we want to grow quickly. We may enter into a capital campaign to build a new facility. We may want to expand our programming into a completely new area. And in those instances, we may get one-time investment, right? One-time cash infusions that add onto our balance sheet and then enter the cycle of the business model, right? And so always looking for what is our normal everyday business model, and then where are those places where we need those one-time investments to grow quickly or to make like a quantum leap. in our ability to achieve on our mission. So there's a difference between a business model, which is the annual results of our operations. What are the results of our day-to-day work, right? That's our business model. And then our capital structure is like if we were to take a Polaroid of our overall financial health at any moment in time, that would show us what our capital structure is. To look at this a little bit more closely, a capitalization, if I were to look at your balance sheet, capitalization is how those resources as allocated on the balance sheet are aligned with our short-term and long-term mission and impact goals, right? So in an ideal world, if I were to look at your balance sheet right now, if I were to look at your capital structure and where your assets are allocated, I would be able, just by looking at your balance sheet and looking at that capital structure, to know what your mission priorities are, right? And how you achieve them. So for example, if I look and I see that most of your assets are allocated to a physical building, then the assumption would be that a lot of your mission has to do with providing services in a physical space, right? So our balance sheet needs are items beyond our income statement, right? Our income statement simply tells us how much money is coming in and how much money is going out. What our balance sheet tells us is where we might need capital, right? Where we might need an infusion of capital. And there's really three scenarios that we're talking about when we talk about capital structure. The first is this image you see here, which is undercapitalized. You're trying to carry too much and you don't have enough funding to support it. And so your metaphorical truck is going to tip over. The second scenario is that you're miscapitalized, right? You have a lot of funding, but it's in the wrong place. So even though I might look at your balance sheet and I see that you own much more than you owe, those funds are allocated in a way that is not aligned with your mission and long-term vision for your organization. So you may be miscapitalized. The third scenario is that you are well capitalized, right? You have the assets in the right place to support your mission in a really aligned way. So before we go any further, and again, there's no judgment associated with any of this, take a moment and reflect which of these scenarios feels the most aligned with where you and your organization are. Are you undercapitalized, which might feel like not being sure if you're going to make payroll or not needing to defer payment on bills, right? Those are signs that maybe we're undercapitalized. Are you miscapitalized, which might feel like looking at your balance sheet and saying, we have so much cash, but it's all restricted to these specific areas and we can't touch it, right? In order to meet our day-to-day expenses. That might be what it feels like to be miscapitalized. Well capitalized, you may feel really confident in your organizational infrastructure. You may know that you're able to meet your bills, meet your obligations, and even have some space for longer-term strategic planning. Right? That's what signs of a well-capitalized organization are. And wherever you're starting from is completely fine. The idea is to be very honest with ourselves so that we can work with the data that's real to make aligned decisions in support of our mission. So if we were to have like a magic wand, which unfortunately we don't, and think about what a capital structure in a perfect dreamy dream world would look like. It might look like this, right? We might be able to pay bills, managing cash flow is a breeze, no problem. We're getting all the right data. We know exactly how much money is coming in and coming out on a monthly basis. You're probably not worried about equipment breaking. If a copier breaks, does anybody still use copiers, but a computer breaks or the roof needs fixing, it's no problem. You know that you have the funds set aside to pay for it, and you have a plan for any debt. You're excited by new opportunities, not burdens. That's a huge one. I can't tell you how many organizations I've spoken with who are kind of up against a wall. Somebody's offered them an incredible opportunity, and instead of being excited, they're terrified because they don't have the information to know exactly what the implications of taking that opportunity will be. Because when we have a strong capital structure, we have a safety net that can protect us from the unexpected risks inherent in revenues or programs. And in other words, with a capital structure in a perfect world, we are able to weather really, really tough, uncertain times. And that's why capital structure matters. Because with a solid capital structure, we have financial risk capacity. The idea is that if we have lots of unrestricted cash and receivables, we know that money's coming in that we can actually use. We have a fully available line of credit. We have reserves that have been set aside in order to be a rainy day fund or expand our programs, right? Maybe our fixed assets are in really good shape. And even if they're not, we've been funding their depreciation. And we have reoccurring surpluses year over year. That means that we have a high capacity for risk or change, right? That means not only can we weather hard times, but we can take advantage of opportunities to further our mission if and when they come up. And so it might be interesting to just take a moment before we go on to think about what are the main risks that your organization faces right now? Are they financial? Are they in terms of losing people or resources? Is it about your relationships or reputation? Just think about where the main areas are that you may take on risk in your work. When we think about financial risk, it's really important to have the information available to let you know at any given moment how your organization is doing. We think of this as like taking the pulse of your organization. And we'll look at 3 metrics for that. One is your operating surplus or deficit. And this is essentially a way of measuring your business model performance. And at base level is simply, are you bringing in more money than you're spending, right? Can you cover operating expenses with revenue from your core business model? Where we find that information is on our income statement. We can also find it in our audit, IRS filing, internal statements, budgets, right? And it's a very simple calculation. You take your operating revenue and subtract your operating expenses, and that gives you your surplus deficit. The second metric we'll look at is the months of cash, and that is a measure of liquidity. How much money do we actually have today to spend on our operating expenses, right? How long can we cover our short-term obligations and day-to-day expenses? For that, we'll look at our balance sheet, and we'll look at how to do this calculation in just a couple of moments. But we'll look at our balance sheet. For our expenses, we'll look at our profit and loss statement. We can also find that in our audit and our 990 filing, our internal financials, sometimes even our bank statements. Although if you have multiple accounts, that can get a little bit messy. And the way that we calculate our months of cash is we take our total cash from our balance sheet, then we take our annual expenses and divide them by 12 to get a roughly average monthly burn rate of our expenses, and we divide them to give us our months of cash. And then finally, to give us something a little bit more accurate than just liquidity in months of cash, we look at months of available net assets. So sometimes in our organizations, we'll have a lot of cash on hand, but it's restricted to specific programs or to be released over time. So even though that shows up on the cash line of our balance sheet, it's not available to us. This third calculation, months of available net assets, takes out those restricted funds, right? Lets us know how much of those net assets, of that cash, we actually have available to use. And again, for that, we'll look at the balance sheet and our P&L to get the expenses, our audit, our 990 filing. And the way we get that is on the balance sheet, we take our total net assets without restrictions, so unrestricted net assets, and then we subtract any equity we have in our property and equipment, because as much as we would like to, we cannot pay bills with a building or with equipment, right? And then again, we divide that over by our average monthly expenses that we've gotten from our profit and loss statement, right? And that gives us a bit more of an accurate sense of how much cash we actually have to spend to meet our day-to-day obligations. So here is where you find the information to look at to find how many months of cash we have. So this on the left is a balance sheet, and the cash and cash equivalents is just a straight port over. So $389,000 is what you have, this organization has. Cash in the bank, assets, they may be restricted, they may be unrestricted. We don't know with this measurement. And for that, we take our operating expenses from our P&L, which in this case is $867,000. We divide it by 12 to find a monthly burn rate of $72,259, right? Then we take our total cash from the cash and cash equivalents line. We divide it by the average monthly expenses. And we see that this organization has about 5.5 months. If no other money comes in to the pipeline, then they can keep their doors open and meet their operating obligations for 5.5 months. So again, months of cash is total cash over our average monthly expenses. And then our true safety net, our real ability to mitigate risks, right? When we back out those restricted funds, is our total net assets without restrictions. We back out or subtract the equity we have in our property and equipment. So those pieces of property and equipment that we own. And then we divide that by our average monthly expenses. The question that always comes up at this point, not always, but like 90% of the time, is, well, how many months of cash should we have in the bank? And the answer, unfortunately, is that it completely depends on your organization and your business model. That said, here are some general guidelines, right? If we have less than a month of expenses in the bank, less than a month of cash, then cash management is key. You may want to be looking at cash flow statements, and we'll look at that in a moment, on a daily or weekly basis. You may have to delay pay vendors or staff, and you might want to access lines of credit. When we have less than a month of cash in the bank, that idea of cash flow planning is really, really important. If we have less than 3 months of cash in the bank, things may feel tight. We might have periods of low cash. It might limit our ability to take advantage of new opportunities, and lines of credit might be useful, but we have a little bit more breathing room. Then when we have 3 to 6 months of cash in the bank, you definitely have some room to breathe. In this case, there's space for longer term strategic thinking, how to further build those reserves, right? You may have some short-term rainy day funds, but you're going to want to be thinking about how to leverage what you already have to build those reserves even further. And then finally, if you have 6 or more months of cash in the bank, you can handle a certain amount of risk, right? You can take on new opportunities. You can withstand some financial shocks like facility repairs, funding cuts, and even recessions, right? And at 6 months or more, you may want to look at your reserves and start dividing them up into different buckets, like a facilities reserve, a rainy day fund, an opportunity fund, all in collaboration with your board. I want to share that I was recently working with an organization that had 10 months of cash in the bank, and the executive director thought that that was not enough, right? The executive director was under tremendous stress and pressure from the board to get that to up to a year of reserves. And it was very comforting for her to see that generally in the sector, a nonprofit organization that has 6 or more months of cash in the bank is doing quite well and is able to think more strategically. So take a moment again before we go on and just reflect where you fall on this. How many months of cash do you and your organization have? And again, we don't want any judgment to be associated with this. And it may be, as was the case with somebody I worked with recently, that they simply don't have the information. It's locked somewhere in a computer. So this is a great opportunity to take a moment and go find your balance sheet, your income statement, your profit and loss, even your audit, and do this calculation. So when we are looking at either organizations that don't have a ton of liquidity, right, that have 1, maybe 3 months of cash in the bank, then a cash flow tool is an incredibly powerful strategic and planning tool that you can use to help ensure that you're able to continue to meet your financial obligations and pursue your mission. And a cash flow projection simply gives you visibility into the timing of cash when it comes into your organization and when it flows out. So you can get a better understanding of how much risk you can tolerate, and there's less uncertainty about whether and when cash will be available to meet your needs as they arise. I want to draw a distinction between a cash flow challenge and a cash challenge. A cash flow issue is a temporary lack of cash due to timing of receipts. In other words, if you have, for example, a government contract and they are late in paying you, that may create a cash flow challenge where you know the money is coming in, you're even recognizing it on your income statement or on your balance sheet, but it simply hasn't shown up as cash yet, right? That's a great time to access a line of credit or an internal reserve in order to bridge that gap, right? That's a cash flow challenge, very different than a cash challenge, which indicates some sort of an issue with your business model. Cash issues are a loss of funding where you get a cash shortage that has no predictable end date. In other words, your business model is consistently producing deficits instead of breaking even or even surpluses. And so these two different types of challenges invite very different conversations around how to navigate them. So when we're talking about cash flows, first, your budget doesn't show it to you. Your budget shows you how much income you're realizing and how much expenses are going out. But often, right, we recognize income before the cash comes in. For example, if we get a letter from a foundation promising payment in the future, we will most likely recognize that as income in our system. So when we're working with cash flow, you can do this monthly, weekly, daily, quarterly, right? Whatever makes sense for your organization. And again, if you're in a place where you are really strapped for cash and in a challenging situation, you may want to do a cash flow analysis daily. You can see that we have a cash flow planning tool with step-by-step instructions at the link that you see on the screen. I encourage you to pause it or just go to nff.org. COVID-19 tools and resources. I believe it's right on the homepage, and you'll find this cash flow projection tool and user guide there. Here's what a cash flow projection might look like in its most basic form. So you can see over on the left, we've got our beginning cash balance right at the top, and these are in hundreds of thousands. So this 120 is actually 120,000, right? We have how much cash is coming in. Well, 40,000 in ticket sales. We got a $110,000 grant that actually, we didn't just get the letter, the cash actually came into the organization. And so in January of 2018, our total cash receipts were $150,000. Then we spent $40,000 in payroll, $90,000 on rent for a total cash spend of $130,000. Our net surplus, right, our net cash is $20,000, giving us an ending cash balance of $140,000. And that 140 goes right up to the top line, the beginning cash balance for February 2018. So a few strategies for managing cash flow. And again, if you look at the link that takes you to the cash flow planning tool, there's a much more elaborate, detailed version of that. We just wanted to give you a sense of, in its most basic form, what a cash flow projection looks like. So it's really 4 broad strategies that are available to us to manage cash flow if we find ourselves having a cash flow crunch. The first and most simple is to simply have cash, have it on hand, have internal reserves built from those unrestricted operating surpluses that result from our business model. We can also approach funders to ease restrictions on existing revenue, right? Let's say an individual or a foundation gave us funds for a specific project, and we need that money in order to fulfill our operating obligations, some funders are very open to us going to them. And as long as we have a compelling reason and our business model is sound, they may be likely to release those restrictions so that we can continue to pursue our mission, right? So strategy one, have cash. Strategy two is to reduce spending. One way to do that is to negotiate favorable payment plans with our vendors and our lenders, maybe ask for deferred payments. And the other is to minimize expenses. And minimize expenses, this is not something that we're suggesting lightly, because sometimes it might mean reducing staff, right? So this is not something that we necessarily want to do flippantly. And often there are some expenses that we're able to reduce without impacting our core mission, our culture, or our people. So the second strategy is hanging on to the cash that we do have by not spending it. The third is to receive cash. We can approach funders for accelerated or advanced payments, right? Oftentimes, especially, let's say your board of directors has committed to contributing a certain amount at the end of the year. If we find ourselves in a cash flow crunch, having a challenge, then we may be able to approach them and ask them to accelerate that giving, right? So that we can have that cash in hand, even though we've already maybe realized it on our income statement, we don't have the cash. So if they accelerate the payment, they can have the cash in hand to meet our daily operating obligations, right? We can also change the timing of particular events or annual appeals. I know a lot of organizations over the past year shifted year-end giving a little bit earlier in the year, maybe even the spring, in order to get an infusion of cash into the organization because funding cycles shifted over the past 18 months. And also, we may be able to convert funds from ticket revenue and events to donations. I know a lot of organizations last year had sold sponsorships to their annual event, their annual gala, whatever their annual fundraiser is, and they were able to approach those sponsors and people who had already purchased tickets and say, hey, for the safety of the community and for our own mental and physical well-being, we're not going to have an event this year, but we're hoping that we'll be able to roll that sponsorship over into general operating support so that we can continue to provide amazing programs to the community. And for the most part, folks are generally receptive to that. So that's another option for bringing more cash in. And the final strategy we have is to borrow cash, to draw on an external line of credit or bridge loan if appropriate. And the key words here are if appropriate, right? Again, going back to that idea of a cash challenge versus a cash flow challenge, if we are simply in need of plugging a gap, we know money is coming in, we know we'll be able to pay the loan back, then accessing that external line of credit can be a really effective way to navigate a cash flow challenge. If, however, we have a really kind of deep-seated business model challenge that is leading to month-over-month deficits, then an external line of credit might actually make the situation worse because now we're taking on more debt, right? That we don't know how we're going to pay it back. So it's a difference between accessing a line of credit strategically and accessing it to mask a deficit in the business model. So again, our goal in this webinar was to really explore these three areas. One was to look at the impact the pandemic had on the nonprofit sector, right? To really look at how organizations responded. The second was to really deepen our understanding of capital structure and how it impacts our organization's futures, and also what a really thriving capital structure might look and feel like if we don't already have one. And finally, we looked at metrics. We looked at how to assess our organization's financial health and align decisions. We also looked at the powerful cash flow planning tool that can help us really navigate those times that might feel a little bit tight. It's a lot of information. So one of the ways that we like to invite folks to reflect during these webinars is to just take a moment right now and write down one thing, one concept or idea that you learned from these last few minutes together. And then once you've done that, take a moment and see if anything elicited an emotional response, right? A lot of times when we're talking about business models and we're talking about months of cash in the bank or deficits, a lot of times that elicits some kind of an emotional response. And so just take a moment and see if that's there for you. And then finally, what is one concrete action that you might be able to take using the information that we went over in this webinar? What's one small thing, even if it's calculating the months of cash, taking some of the information in this webinar to your board of directors or to your staff, one concrete action you can take today or maybe tomorrow that you can bring back to your community or organization. So here's where we go from here. Next, in the next webinar, Robert Kagan will take you through financial planning part 1, where you're really going to take a deeper dive and look at your income statements and how to really build the story of how your organization has performed over time. And we'll also look at how to forecast revenue and expenses and some basic budgeting best practices as you move forward. So from here, we go a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of organizational financial management and strategy. Looking further into the future, we're going to have more a deeper dive onto cash flow planning a little bit later in the series. And then we'll go all the way around to telling your financial story, how to engage in partnerships and collaborations in a way that everybody wins, and understanding how to cover the full cost of your business. So in general, we're going to be going deep into the nitty-gritty of financial management and gradually expanding back out into these broader strategic conversations. And that's it for this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn with us today, and hope that you've gotten something out of it and that you enjoy the rest of the series. Again, I'm Michael Cass, consultant with Nonprofit Finance Fund, and thank you so much for giving us your time and learning with us.